Merci, Monsieur le Président. L'inflation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And before starting, I would just like to say that I'll be sharing my time with the Honourable Member for Tobique-Mactaquac. Inflation is the cost of the spending that the government said would be free. We know that this Liberal-NDP government promised a utopia. They said they would deliver results for free. They said that the costs of this spending would never hit Canadians because the budget would balance itself. Or they said that interest rates were low and that, as though by magic, the government would be able to keep increasing spending faster than growth in the population and the cost of living without repercussions. After 8 years of this government and this Liberal-NDP Prime Minister, Canadians are seeing their bills come in. They can see their mortgages, which have gone up on average by 150%, more than doubled. I spoke to a worker in BC who's now spending $7,500 a month. $7,500 a month on his mortgage. He's a middle-class individual with 3 children. $4,000 out of that $7,500, $4,000 is composed of the interest he's paying. So he's not actually using that money to pay back the principal on his mortgage. Most of it is just money wasted on interest. That's almost $50,000 a year that his family is spending on interest on their mortgage. That's inconceivable for the average family, but that's the reality after 8 years of this Prime Minister, who ironically is the Prime Minister who promised he would help the middle class and those working hard to join it. We don't hear so much these days about the famous middle class. It seems to have been forgotten because the Prime Minister doesn't want to remind us of the sufferings his policy caused for the middle class. We now have members of the middle class who are homeless. Now, it's true that in all countries, including Canada, there has always been homelessness. But we have never, since the Great Depression, seen people from the middle class who are homeless. And that's becoming more and more common now. We now have nurses, carpenters who are living in their cars because of increases in their mortgage payments. And related increases to rents. 8 years ago, the Prime Minister promised to decrease housing costs, but since then, housing costs have doubled, rents have doubled, mortgage payments have doubled, and deposits have doubled. When I was the Minister for Housing, it cost half of what it costs today to pay for rent, your mortgage, or a deposit. The government's decisions have consequences. The government has increased spending by $600 billion. That's an increase that represents a doubling to $2.4 trillion. We're talking about drastic increases to the money supply. In fact, 8 times faster than the real growth of the economy. That means that the money to buy products is growing 8 times faster than the supply of products, which leads to inflation. The Bank of Canada has had to respond by increasing interest rates. And that ends up hurting the same people who are struggling to buy food and to pay for their rent or their mortgage. And what does the government do? Well, the government ensures that the Bank of Canada will be keeping interest rates high. According to the former Minister of Finance, John Manley, this government is continuing to press the inflation accelerator, which means that the Bank of Canada is forced to use the brakes by raising interest rates. You might think that the government would have tried to slow things down with its deficit spending, and that they might try to reach a balanced budget, but they've done just the opposite. 6 months ago, the government said that it wanted to balance the budget by 2028. And then suddenly, they changed their mind. In the budget, they said, we will never balance the budget. Last week, we learned from the parliamentary budget officer that the deficit is 15% higher than they promised in their budget. They've totally lost control. And Canadians are paying a high price for that. And that's without even getting into the steep price that our children will have to pay. And that is why we are proposing common sense solutions. Common sense. Including legislation to force the government to cut $1 spending for each dollar that's in new spending. We also are asking the government to end spending on things like ArriveCan, the infrastructure bank, and other useless spending that has led to government waste. The goal here should be to balance the budget to reduce interest rates, inflation, and enable Canadians to feed their family and keep their home. That's common sense policy, Mr. Speaker.
After 8 years of this Prime Minister and his NDP Liberal government, we're starting to see the hard reality that inflation is the price you pay for all of the programs the government told you were free. Remember, the Prime Minister said he could double the debt, but don't worry, the budget would balance itself. He said that interest rates were low, so not only were deficits permanently affordable, we couldn't afford not to spend. Well, here we are with the devastating human consequences not so long after that, because, as Pythagoras says, numbers rule the universe. No matter how many words are spoken, no matter how many soft lullabies are sung, the reality is that when you spend what you don't have, you drive up the cost for everyone else. And here we are, the cost of government has driven up the cost of living. $500 billion of inflationary debt has bid up the goods we buy and the interest we pay. According to former Finance Minister, Liberal Finance Minister John Manley, the government spending is pressing its foot on the inflationary gas pedal, which forces the Bank of Canada to press on the brakes with higher interest rates. And now I bump into people across Canada who are living in financial terror. A shipyard worker in Vancouver told me that his monthly mortgage payment is now $7,500. He's a shipyard worker, Mr. Speaker. 4,000 of the 750, of the 7,500, 4,000 is just for interest. His family is spending basically 50 grand a year on interest for their mortgage. This after the Prime Minister, his budget documents, and his bank governor told that man that rates would stay low. You'd think the government would reverse its policies, but they're doing the opposite. A year ago, they said they would balance the budget by 2028. 6 months ago, they changed their minds, so they'd balance the budget. Never. Last week, we found from the budget officer that the deficit is 15% bigger than the government claimed only 6 months ago. They have lost total control of the spending. Our common sense plan caps spending, cuts waste, in order to balance the budget and bring down interest rates and inflation. And let us do it before the hundreds of billions of dollars of mortgages renew into these higher rates. Let us save their homes and our future. It's common sense. My colleagues will work to bring home this common sense here in Canada. Your home, my home, our home. Let's bring it home. Thank you.